Part 1. The extra plank. The day began not with sun, but with rain. Not the kind that leaves the world fresh and clean, but an autumn rain, cold and insistent, needling through the pine needles and turning the ground into pools of blind, muddy water. Steve closed the door, muffling the hiss, and leaned against it, his back to the rough wood. He was alive. That was the only thing that mattered after that night, after the desperate flight from a horde of creepers in the dark tangles of a rare jungle. The cabin was his salvation. Small, square, built from the dark oak he'd felled right here. One room with a hearth, a table, a bed. No windows except a narrow slit by the door. Safety. He'd built it in 3 days. On the edge of exhaustion, when his trembling hands could barely hold an axe, the first wrongness came not as a sign, but as boredom. Rested, he set about mending his tools. He sat on the bed, laid the iron ingots on the table, and his gaze fell to the floor. The floor was made of wide oak planks, laid tight. He remembered each one, where the knots were, where the grains swirled. But now, under the table, near the leg, he saw a different one. Narrower, lighter, as if made of birch. The boards around it were perfectly flush. This one lay a fraction deeper, as if it had been pressed in, not nailed. It bore no marks of any tool, no axe strikes or saw lines, only a strange smoothness. As if it had grown there, Steve froze. Just fatigue, he said aloud, to hear a human voice in the cabin's silence. Must have replaced it, forgot. Or used an old spare. But he didn't remember birch. He had only cut oak. There were no birches near this clearing. He knelt, ran his fingers along the seam. Cold. Dry. The same as the others. He stared until his eyes lost focus, and then it seemed the birch plank pulsed faintly, as if something seeped beneath it. Steve jerked upright, stepping back. Glitches. Hunger. Shock. He decided to ignore it. That was his strategy. Bury himself in routine. Gather berries, fish in the small lake beyond the clearing, expand the storage. The day passed. Night fell imperceptibly as the rain ceased, leaving only a wet, saturated darkness. Steve sat by the hearth, warming his hands. And then he heard it. Dig dig. Dig dig. A soft, muffled sound. Not from above, not from the door. From outside, on the side of the cabin where his bed stood. The sound of a shovel biting into wet earth. Slow. Methodical. The work of one person. His blood turned to ice. Steve held his breath, pressed his ear to the wall. The sound was so close, right behind the logs, he could imagine the digger just centimeters from his face. Dig dig. Pause. Dig dig. He didn't dare go out. Who could it be? A villager? A wanderer like him? But there were no villages. And the sound. It was too localized. As if the digger knew exactly where Steve sat, and was doing it on purpose, just on the other side of the wall. The sound lasted exactly 120 strokes. Steve counted to keep from screaming. Then silence. Absolute dead. He didn't venture out until dawn. At first light, pale and sleepless, he circled the cabin. The earth by that wall was undisturbed, unturned. The grass was matted by his own footprints. But at chest height on the trunk of the pine tree nearest the cabin, he saw a mark. A clear, deep imprint of an iron shovel blade. As if someone had driven it into the wood with force. The tree was dry. The mark was fresh. He went back inside, barred the door. His eyes were drawn again to the extra plank. Now it didn't just look foreign. It looked like a hatch. Something that sealed, and that night the sound repeated. The same spot. The same rhythmic dig-dig. But this time, after the pause, a new sound came. A faint, almost imperceptible scraping. Like a long nail being dragged slowly down the outside of the oak log, right at the level of his pillow. Steve recognized that sound. It was the sound he made when he fumbled in the dark for a seam in the wall, to find its edge. Someone on the other side was feeling his cabin, and then his gaze, wandering in the gloom, fell on the table. On it lay his 3 iron ingots, ready for a new tool. He had placed 3 there. Now there were 4. The 4th was not iron. It was a dull, greenish-gray, cold even in the dark. It was an ingot of weathered copper, a material he had not mined, nor had ever possessed in his chest, not once in all his time in this world. Part 2, the copper truth. The copper ingot was real. Its cold, gritty texture was undeniable under his thumb. Steve didn't touch it for a long time. He just stared, as if it were a poisonous insect that had crawled onto his table. His mind raced through impossible explanations. Had he sleepwalked, mined an ore vein he'd never seen, smelted it? No furnace was lit. No pickaxe was worn. He picked it up. It was heavier than iron. On its underside, faint but deliberate, were scratches. Not random. They formed a pattern, a simple, angular spiral, like a squared-off whirlpool. It looked like a child's drawing of a vortex. It made his head ache to look at it for too long. That day, he didn't leave the clearing. The routine was broken. He spent the morning obsessively counting his belongings. Every piece of coal, every stick, every morsel of bread. Everything was accounted for. Except the plank. Except the copper, and then he looked at the walls. He had built them with a simple, alternating pattern. Every log was the same. He walked the perimeter inside, tracing the joins with his finger. Halfway along the back wall, his finger caught. The join here was perfect. Too perfect. The two logs met seamlessly, with none of the slight roughness or bark edge of the others. It was as if this section of wall had been carved from a single, impossible piece of wood that bent at a right angle. The digging didn't come that night. The silence was worse. It was a listening silence. Steve sat in the center of the room, back to the hearth, facing the strange, seamless corner. He felt like a specimen in a box. He must have dozed off. He awoke to a new sound. Not from outside. From inside the wall. It was a wet, organic sound. A soft pop, followed by a slow, fibrous tearing. Then a dribble, like mud slipping. It came from the space between the logs, from the very corner that was too perfect. Steve scrambled back, grabbing his iron sword. He watched, heart hammering against his ribs. In the seam of the perfect corner, something was emerging. Not an entity, not a mob. A substance. A thick, dark slurry, the color of old moss and wet clay. It oozed out slowly, defying gravity, creeping up the inner surface of the wall instead of down. It moved with a terrible, sentient slowness. As it spread, it absorbed the torchlight, leaving not shadow, but a patch of deeper, textured darkness. A smell filled the room, not decay, but the scent of deep, undisturbed soil, of stone that has never seen the sun, of roots that go down to the world's cold heart. The slurry formed a rough patch, about the size of his hand. And then it stopped. It just stayed there, a weeping stain on his wall. A part of his world that was wrong. Terror gave way to a grim, icy resolve. This was his home. This was his world. He would not be colonized by some silent, seeping madness. He approached the stain, sword raised. He prodded it with the tip. The substance was gelatinous, resilient. It didn't drip. It simply was. In a fit of rage and desperation, he swung the sword, aiming to scrape it off. The iron blade passed through the slurry and bit into the wall behind it with a solid thunk. But when he pulled back, the slurry was untouched. It hadn't been scraped away. It had parted. And in the instant the blade was inside it, Steve felt something. A vast, hollow emptiness. A loneliness so profound it was like a physical vacuum in his soul. And beneath that, a slow, patient, grinding pressure. The pressure of layers upon layers of stone, of continents sitting on a void that wanted to be filled. It was the feeling of the world's foundation, and it was awake, and it was hungry. He stumbled back, dropping the sword. The sensation faded, leaving only a ringing vertigo. The slurry remained. The next morning, the stain was gone. The wall was just a wall. But the extra plank in the floor was now warm to the touch. And outside, when he finally mustered the courage to look, he found a single, fresh block of dirt placed neatly in the center of the clearing. It wasn't part of the terrain. It was a player-placed block. And it was one block higher than the ground around it. It was a pillar. A marker. It was the first block of a path, and it was pointing towards his door. Part 3. The pillar and the path. The dirt pillar stood in insolent isolation, a crude monument to violation. It was not simply placed, it was precise. Its edges were sharp, its top perfectly flat, as if placed by a careful, unemotional hand. Steve approached it like a man approaching a sleeping predator. He circled it. It was ordinary dirt. Coarse, granular, smelling of rain. He broke it with a single punch. It crumbled into his inventory. The ground beneath was normal grass. For a long, taut moment, nothing happened. Then, from the edge of the clearing where the treeline began its dense watch, he heard it, the soft, distinct plop of a block being set. Another dirt pillar. 2 blocks high this time. A cold logic settled over his panic. This was communication. Or imitation. Or a slow, deliberate encirclement. He ran towards the new pillar, his boots sucking at the mud. As he neared it, he heard the sound again, plop, behind him, back near the cabin. He spun. A third pillar, 1 block high, stood near his woodpile. He was not being hunted. He was being mapped. The corners of his territory were being marked. He spent the day in a state of siege, his back to the cabin wall, eyes darting between the pillars. No more sounds came. At dusk, he made a decision born of pure, irrational defiance. He took the dirt blocks from his inventory, the ones from the first pillar, and began to build. Not a wall. A path. He laid a line of dirt blocks from his doorstep, past the remaining 2 markers, and into the tree lane, in the direction the first pillar had pointed. If something wanted to show him a direction, he would pave the road. The work was calming in its mundanity. Place, step, place. The forest swallowed the path's end in shadow. He stood at the edge of the dark, listening. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustle of spiders. Only the dripping of water from needles. That night, the digging did not return. Instead, the cabin expanded. Steve awoke with a start, his internal clock screaming it was past dawn, but the cabin was dark. Pitch dark. No light from the door slit. He fumbled for a torch, struck flint. The steel spark illuminated the room for a fraction of a second. It was bigger. The wall opposite his bed, the one with the hearth, was now 3 blocks farther away. The ceiling was higher by 2. The room was a perfect, empty cube of dark oak, the new planks seamlessly integrated with the old. The hearth, the table, his bed, all remained in their original positions, stranded in a sea of unfamiliar floor. The air was dead and still, like the air in a long-sealed tomb, in the center of the new, vast floor space. A single object sat. A crafting table. But it was wrong. The usual plank texture was warped, the lines curved instead of straight, the top surface a dark, purplish wood he didn't recognize. He approached it, torch held high. On its surface, arranged in the familiar 2x2 grid of a crafting recipe, were 4 items, 3 sticks, and the greenish copper ingot, the recipe for a copper shovel. He felt a scream building in his throat, but it had no sound. This was a suggestion. An instruction. The world was not just breaking its rules, it was trying to use him. To make him an accomplice in his own unraveling. He refused. He took the items, but instead of crafting, he threw the copper ingot into the hearth's fire. It didn't melt or smelt. It blackened, then began to vibrate, emitting a low, subaudible hum that made his teeth ache. He kicked it out of the fire with a poker. It rolled into a corner, smoking, the spiral scar on its underside glowing faintly. Exhausted, he collapsed onto his bed, staring at the distant, now alien ceiling. He must have slept. He was awakened by the sound of his own door opening. He sat bolt upright. The door was still shut, barred from the inside. But the sound had been clear, a creak of hinges he knew intimately. And the air in the cabin had changed. It smelled of pine and wet stone, the outside. As if the door had been opened elsewhere, in a copy of his cabin, and the air had bled through. Then, from the new, empty section of his floor, came a new series of sounds. The crisp snap of a plank being placed. Then another. Quick, efficient. The sounds of building. Steve lay paralyzed, listening to an invisible presence construct something in the dark, 3 paces from his bed. The building went on for minutes. Planks, the hollow thump of wool, the metallic ting of a lantern being hung. Then silence. Dawn's first gray light finally seeped through the door slit. It revealed the addition. In the middle of the empty floor space stood a perfect, small-scale replica of his own bed. Not a copy. A child's version. It was only 2 blocks long, made of the same warped, purplish wood as the crafting table. On it was a tiny, pixelated pillow. And on the pillow lay a single, freshly picked poppy. It was a guest bed. Something had built itself a place to sleep in his home. The message was no longer one of menace from outside. It was an announcement of cohabitation. The violation was complete, intimate, and utterly, chillingly polite. Steve looked from the small, impossible bed to the still smoldering copper ingot in the corner. The spiral on its underside had stopped glowing. It now looked like an eye closed in sleep. He understood then. The digging, the pillars, the slurry, the expansion, they weren't attacks. They were adjustments. The world was not trying to drive him mad. It was trying to accommodate him. To fit him into a new, wrong shape. And the thing sharing his cabin, the silent builder, the mapmaker. It wasn't an intruder. It was the landlord,